spanking new peer-to-peer policy pod. I am Brian Morgenstern here with the great Sam Lyman. Lots to talk about today. Bitcoin busting through its all-time high, nearing its all-time high, even on an inflation-adjusted basis, even with the anti-crypto army of Senator Elizabeth Warren attacking us constantly. Bitcoin continues to thrive. So let's get into several topics today. Sam, I'll kick it over to you.
Yeah, well, let's stick with that topic, Brian. Bitcoin's all-time highs. It was just last week that we were celebrating an all-time high, and then it climbed above the previous all-time high. So I'm curious to see every week as we film this podcast, just how often we'll be celebrating that all-time high over the next few months. So Brian, one thing that we know is driving this soaring price in Bitcoin's value is the Bitcoin ETF. When it was approved a few weeks ago, a lot of people speculated that it would be a sell the news event, right? However, it's been just the opposite of that. Just this last week, we saw a single day where there was over $1 billion in inflow to the Bitcoin ETF. So to kick us off today, let's talk about the all-time high. I'm curious from your perspective, what do you think is driving the price of Bitcoin up to these new heights? And do you draw any connection between Bitcoin's all-time high and some of the policies coming out of Washington?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a number of reasons for it. Adoption is a key reason. You're having millions of people, including investors that are going through institutions the size of BlackRock. There are 11 ETFs out there. I think they've raised some $40 billion. Of course, the Bitcoin market cap, we're looking at over $1 trillion. So it's still not a huge percentage of the overall holdings, but it's bringing with it institutional legitimacy and an institutional customer base, which is driving demand much faster than the supply of Bitcoin. So we have the halving coming up in April. Currently, for every block mined, it's 6.25 Bitcoin. In a month, it's only going to be 3.125 Bitcoin. So the supply gap or the supply production of Bitcoin per day is actually going to narrow even further, while we see demand continuing to grow and grow, because as the price goes up, as people discover what is Bitcoin and what it stands for, which is basically sound monetary policy, and you still have high inflation, you still have a pretty unsustainable level of prices, people are going to be looking for places to store their money that is not going to deflate the way the dollar has been lately. So I think you're going to continue to have much higher demand than supply. That's the most basic, at its most basic, why the price of Bitcoin is going up so fast. And in previous cycles, there's usually a dip. You're not usually hitting an all-time high before a halving, but now we are, because of these vehicles for new entrants to the market. So I think you might not see the typical dip the way you have in the past. Now, there's some caveat to this, I would say, a word of caution. And this is not investment advice. I am not an investment advisor. But something to bear in mind is that you have a lot of funds getting into this space. They see the halving coming, which of course means cut supply, maintained high demand. You may have some piece of the market selling the news in the aftermath of the halving, trying to harvest some profits. So there's a chance that there could be a dip based on that market dynamic. I am not sure. It's just something to bear in mind. But with millions and millions and millions more people getting into Bitcoin, the available supply narrowing, that's a recipe for a higher price. And that's why you're seeing it.
Yeah, it's beautiful to see as well. I like to call Bitcoin Schrodinger's asset. By that, I mean, when inflation is bad, people see Bitcoin as a hedge against inflation, right? Now, let's say inflation comes down and we move towards a more risk-on environment. Bitcoin suddenly becomes a risk-on asset. So it can be seen as both risk-on and risk-off. And the combination of those two things, I think, just continues to drive the price up over the next several years. So, Brian, I think there's also an element of monetary debasement that is playing into this flight to quality, as Larry Fink would call it, towards Bitcoin, right? Can you talk a little bit about, for example, the Fed's money printing and how that might be affecting people's evolving views of Bitcoin itself?
Yeah, 100%. We've had numerous interviews, on CNBC from very trusted voices, from Democrat billionaire investor Mike Novogratz to Republican former Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin. Full disclosure, my former boss, both of whom were in agreement. These, really trusted minds in the space, both in agreement that our problem now with regard to inflation and is related to the disastrous spending that we have right now in Washington. We've got some 40% of the budget is deficit spending. We are nearing $35 trillion, I think, in our national debt. We're at the point where debt service is one of the biggest expenses in our budget, comparable to the Department of Defense and entitlements. Some of these things are driving something of a debt spiral, which is only going to further drive inflation, which is only going to further devalue the dollar, which makes Bitcoin even more attractive. And I think it is something of a report card on our country's fiscal health. We had loose monetary policy for a long time. We've had drunken sailors spending out of our fiscal policymakers in Congress for a long time. And so it's just getting a lot harder to trust the value of a dollar. You're seeing it shrink. Now, the United States has the benefit of being comparably more healthy than virtually every other country in the world. And so that is definitely helping quite a bit. But that's not forever necessarily. I mean, the United States still needs to get its fiscal and monetary house in order. And until it does, you're going to see more and more people voting with their wallets and storing their money in Bitcoin instead of cash. Because as you've pointed out, over the last number of years, the value of the dollar has been inflated away, while the value of Bitcoin has gone up and up and up. So as a store of value, it's more attractive the worse our public policy is in Washington.
Along with that, I'm curious your take on this idea. So Bitcoin, I believe, could be a check on the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve itself is nowhere outlined in the Constitution. You might even say it's an extra constitutional body, right? So there's nothing to really check the Federal Reserve's money printing until Bitcoin. So the analogy I would like to draw here is that to check the power, the government's monopoly on power, the founders put in the Second Amendment, which is the individual right to bear arms, right? That ensures that, no matter what government abuses there are, individual citizens at least have the opportunity to defend themselves with arms. Now, from a monetary perspective, we know that the Fed can print ad infinitum. They've even said we can print to infinity if we want to. There will always be enough dollars in our system. Now, until Bitcoin, they really could go forward with that. But I think Bitcoin sets up a scenario where you actually have an alternative to the US dollar that people could flock to if the Federal Reserve and Congress together continue to debase our currency. I'm curious, Brian, your thoughts on that take. Do you think that Bitcoin itself could be an effective check on money printing?
I think it's possible because I think what we're seeing is an era of everything old is new again. So the US government didn't used to be the sole supplier of money. In fact, until the early 1900s, money was largely made by private entities, by banks. After it was then, pegged to the gold standard. The value of an ounce of gold would dictate the value of a dollar. It wasn't until post-World War II era that we depegged from any precious metal or commodity and went to this kind of floating fiat currency. And when that happened, I think the advocates of it would say, well, we have a more flexible economy. They're better able to kind of stabilize things in crisis. But the fact of the matter is, if you have sound money that is tied to a commodity or a basket of commodities of things that people actually use in their lives, you get a more stable system of money. And we know that because of generations of history. And so to circle back to your direct question, if we have a currency / commodity that is being used to store value and in many cases, transact. You then effectively have a check on the dollar like we haven't had in 50 years to create a market for consumers to vote with their wallets. And if you don't have any alternative, or people get sensitive when you say it's a competitor to the dollar. I view it more as a supplement or a complement to the dollar. And I think in this instance, when the government gets too loose in its monetary policy and too profligate in its spending, then you have this sound alternative, this commodity / currency that people can save in. And you can look at real world examples. Now, like I said, the United States is the strongest country compared to others, but in weaker economies like Nigeria, like in El Salvador, Argentina, others, we've seen hyperinflation when the government's too loose with their monetary policy, too profligate in their spending. People look for an alternative so that they can save their wealth, so it doesn't disappear, it doesn't evaporate along with the value of their money. So Bitcoin's serving that purpose right now. And I think whether it's sort of conscious or formalized or informal, what have you, the market's deciding. And people are seeing that you might be collecting US dollars, you might be putting out US dollars, but if you have a mountain of cash to save, whether it's $100 or $1 million or whatever it may be, and you don't need to move it right now, you're probably better off putting it in Bitcoin than US dollars. And then if you're doing especially cross-border transactions, it might be more efficient to do it in Bitcoin. But I'm getting off track. The point being, yes, I think you're right that in an era of way too high spending and loose monetary policy where the value of each dollar is declining, you're looking for that alternative asset that I think will, in practice, because of the market and because of what people are doing, it's going to put pressure on Washington to get its fiscal house in order. I think that's a good thing. I think it's long overdue, and Bitcoin just might be a catalyst that nudges it in the right direction.
Yeah, that'd be pretty incredible, considering that, for so long people have said, oh, governments will ban Bitcoin, but now it's actually Bitcoin putting pressure on governments to check their spending and money printing a little bit more. So in connection with this, what you said, what was old is new again, it reminds me of the fact that for a long time, countries across the world were on the gold standard. And I think you're seeing a renewed push for some kind of commodity to back national currencies, right? Whether it's gold or Bitcoin. So this is interesting because there's growing speculation within the industry that there has been, quote, a secret sovereign bid for Bitcoin. That there's a country out there that's actually mining and accumulating Bitcoin as we speak and finding ways to access it through these new Bitcoin ETFs. Ryan Selkis at Masari Crypto, he predicted recently that a G20 country will actually come out and announce that they've been accumulating Bitcoin over the past several months, sometime this year or next. So it's a really fascinating idea. In the first cycles of Bitcoin, it was mostly individuals buying. Now it's institutions. And it almost seems like we're already starting to see this new narrative of nation states. I'm curious your thoughts on that. Do you think that we'll see more sovereigns bidding Bitcoin this go round? Or do you think the nation state adoption is maybe a little premature at this point?
It is a fascinating question. And I will say I don't have a crystal ball, but what I have seen is some data that, look, the US has seized, I think in total, probably over 400,000 Bitcoin. I think the US government still holds over 200,000 Bitcoin, mostly seized from illegal transactions, which is a testament to the quality of the blockchain and the transparency of it and the immutability of the ledger. But given, the US government owns a massive supply of Bitcoin. We believe the Chinese government has some amount of Bitcoin. It may be a little less than the US government, but somewhere maybe in that neighborhood. We've seen some reports, not sure how credible, but some reports that the Russian government has stepped up its Bitcoin mining operations. Look, I think that we also saw US presidential candidates, RFK Jr. and Vivek Ramaswamy, come out with the idea that Bitcoin could be part of a basket of commodities that could back the dollar if we were to return to a sound money standard in some way, not just a gold standard, not picking one. It wouldn't be just be Bitcoin. But again, if you're tying the value of a dollar to physical assets that have value globally, then you might get closer to the true value of a dollar in the marketplace and stabilize it somewhat. So given that the US government does own Bitcoin, now I think its policy is generally to sell seized assets. I don't think they're hodling their Bitcoin, although if I were in charge, I'd probably say that's a good idea. You probably should have a strategic reserve, and you should probably hold as much as you can because it's a valuable asset, and you don't want it falling into the hands of someone other than Americans or falling into the hands of our adversaries. If you're another country and you don't want to be subject to the whims of the US government for a variety of reasons, you might have ill intentions, whatever it may be, you probably do want to have as much hard money, sound money as you can, and avoid your currency being subject to, or avoid, your country being weakened by hyperinflation or whatnot. You're going to want to have that alternative as well for the strength of your own government and your own country, because if the value of your currency drops, then you're going to want a harder, more stable asset, to help kind of stabilize your society, or in an ungenerous, unfavorable reading, propping up your government, whatever it may be. The fact is, Bitcoin rising and being a stable and rising store of value, notwithstanding its volatility, it's a good idea for most people and most institutions and most governments to be collecting it. That's what you're seeing now with the institutions adopting it, putting it into all these people's retirement accounts, and staking a position of 1% or whatever the advisors are saying. We're talking about trillions probably worth of Bitcoin that are going to be adopted to be a stabilizing force, to get people exposure, to make sure you're not missing out on this rising tide. I don't see a reason why governments would look at it that differently. So I don't know if Ryan's prediction is right, but I think it would make some sense. Given the governments that already own it, I think they should probably hold on to it, and other governments acquiring it, that makes a lot of sense to me.
Right. And we already saw a country beta testing the idea in El Salvador with Bukele. And I know he took so much heat for years, ever since the last bull run, where he bought Bitcoin more or less at the top and was pilloried by the media for having done it for several years thereafter. However, it should be noted that El Salvador is in profit now to the tune of millions of dollars. And so, that I think is something that people need to remember with Bitcoin. Don't look at the short term, look at the long term. You have to zoom out, right? In that sense, it's a really effective long-term savings instrument if your timeline is 5-10 years as opposed to just a few months. It's something that you save and accumulate as opposed to trade, right? So I want to switch gears just a little bit, because there's always new and exciting news in this space. But what's been interesting to me about this last week is that we saw a lot of mainstream financial institutions come out singing a different tune on Bitcoin. So let's start with The Economist. The Economist wrote an article about Africa potentially being the new frontier for Bitcoin mining, in large part because energy in Africa is very cheap. And they even highlighted in this article the fact that Bitcoin miners are finding ways to help renewable energy projects in Africa become profitable. So there's a lot of places in Africa where renewable energy is abundant, but they don't have customers at all times. And so to make them profitable, Bitcoin miners always need energy. And so essentially, you have Bitcoin miners bootstrapping energy projects to give cheap and abundant energy to citizens of the African continent, which is a pretty incredible development. Then you have the Financial Times, which has long been a huge opponent of Bitcoin. I think it's been very representative of the more establishment viewpoint of Bitcoin as tulip bubble 2.0, as they used to say. But they actually ran an op-ed this last week that conceded, no, there's more to Bitcoin than meets the eye. This isn't simply a tulip bubble. I mean, this has been going on for well over a decade by this point. This is a maturing asset class that is really coming into its own. And then last, we have Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan, who has been one of the fiercest Bitcoin opponents on Wall Street. He, though, came out this week, and even though he didn't say he would buy Bitcoin, he definitely changed his tone when he said, I would never buy Bitcoin, but I will defend your right to buy Bitcoin, just like I would defend your right to smoke cigarettes, right? So it's still not a glowing review of the asset class. At the same time, he seems to be softening a bit in wanting to defend people's right to at least buy and sell Bitcoin. So all of this, in my viewpoint, looks like a Bitcoin vibe shift, for lack of a better term. It seems like attitudes, both among individuals, institutions, and even leaders in government, are starting to change towards Bitcoin. So I'm curious from you, do you think there's an actual Bitcoin vibe shift going on? Is that overblown, or is that about right? And if there is a Bitcoin vibe shift, what do you think is causing it?
It is a tremendous vibe shift, and I think that there's a variety of reasons. Just touching back on your last subject with Bukele, the president of El Salvador, he also made Bitcoin legal tender to help shield his citizens from hyperinflation. Going back on our prior conversation, that's another indicator. But based on all these examples you're giving, there's the KPMG report talking about actually Bitcoin mining as an ESG asset, where it actually enhances the development of alternative fuels and renewable energy. There's a tremendous vibe shift going on. I view it, our culture has seen over the last, I don't know how many years, almost a merger of government and corporations. And so I'll put large institutions into a bucket to apply I think it was Andrew Breitbart's quote, politics is downhill from culture. And I think there have been millions and millions of people interested in this freedom money and a return to sound money, where, it's really hard to buy a house and live a normal life on a single income these days. Our society is very different. And so there's been kind of a yearning for a return to stable value. And that's why, I think Coinbase's statistics at 52 million people are owning digital assets just in the United States. I think that's a low estimate. I think it's much higher than that. This is the type of asset that people have been looking for a long time. There's also a culture to it especially when you talk about Bitcoin. It's been building as a community to millions, to tens of millions. I think around the world, we're probably talking about hundreds of millions. It can no longer be denied by the institutions because there's so many individuals that are involved and enthusiastic about it. And the market has matured so much, I think the institutions are saying, hey, there's money to be made here. That's another, it's a cynical point, but it's a true point. I don't think that Jamie Dimon just became Voltaire overnight and said, I disapprove of what you say, but I'll fight to the death for your right to say it. He was kind of beaten into submission, honestly. And kudos to him for changing his mind. Kudos to him for seeing what's going on out there in the world and adapting. I think that is a good thing. He should be commended for that. It took him too long, but that's all right. we can start over now. What they're seeing is a movement by the people that cannot be denied by the institutions. Bitcoin is frequently referred to in comparison with other disruptive technologies. People say a few different things frequently. The internet democratized information the way Bitcoin is democratizing money. They compare it to Uber. That I lived in New York City when Uber was kind of busting through that brick wall of the taxi medallion regime. If you wanted to be in the paid driver business, you had to pay the city some $500,000 for a medallion you could put on your car that gave you the right to provide that service. Uber just went ahead and did it. And so many people liked it from the consumer standpoint and from the gig economy driver standpoint, people who wanted to supplement their income, that it became electorally impossible for the administration of the city to really try to sit on it and crush that industry. And similarly, I think you're seeing with Bitcoin now, there's so many people who see value in it that the institutions really can't sit on it anymore. It's just busting through that brick wall in a very democratic way. The politics, in this case, both commercial and government institutions, are flowing downhill from culture.
Yeah. So let's stick with that. The idea of politics being downstream of culture, downhill of culture, right? So this is great news. There is a Bitcoin vibe shift, it sounds like. The question is, to what extent has that vibe shift permeated DC? You know, day in and day out, Brian, you and I, we advocate for Bitcoin policy on Capitol Hill and across executive agencies also. There's a lot of education that needs to happen still. We've seen in a lot of our meetings with members of Congress, and people are open-minded to it, right? But do you see the Bitcoin vibe shift already affecting DC, or is Elizabeth Warren and her anti-crypto army, are they sort of the blockade that prevents that vibe shift from really permeating Washington?
No, I think it's looking, I think the folks who are just throwing up their hands and saying no are becoming increasingly more marginalized because, we've seen in our conversations, I think on a bipartisan kind of nonpartisan basis, number one, on a generational level, the younger members get it faster and are more interested in it. And then as you kind of go up the seniority ranks, you're seeing members, regardless of age, regardless of party, regardless of demographics, regardless of anything, they're seeing how many people back at home in their districts care about these things. And so they're actually seeking ways to talk about it to their constituents. So, for example, the conservative Republicans will talk about sort of the libertarian values of self-sovereignty and being able to custody your own money versus a bank that might be able to shut you off if you get in some kind of political trouble. Democrats tend more to talk about environmental sustainability and sort of human rights purposes, sending remittances across borders. I just spoke this week with some human rights activists who operate in the Eastern Bloc, Eastern Bloc countries or former Eastern Bloc countries, where their banking systems are really tightly controlled by their governments. They're not very democratic. And so if you come out against their regime, you might have your money turned off. That's a human rights issue. That's really bipartisan or nonpartisan, but it sometimes will speak to the liberal side of the aisle here in the US that might be looking for an explanation or a reason to support it when they just see their Republican colleagues being enthusiastic. They might not necessarily gravitate towards it, but if you can connect it to issues that those members and those constituents care about, their eyes start to open and you start to build a bipartisan or nonpartisan coalition. And it's really, really interesting. Your example in Africa of, kind of the energy benefits of Bitcoin mining is a hugely important one. We're seeing communities in the United States where Bitcoin mining is helpful for grid stability, helpful for incentivizing new energy generation. We need so much more power for the digital economy of the future. Large flexible loads, which is what you call a Bitcoin mine, are going to be hugely important for that, for co-locating with generation, making financing easier, making it easier to build power plants, whether it's wind or solar or nuclear or hydro or natural gas, whatever it is. You're seeing it really serve multiple values and speaking to different constituencies. So that politics being downstream of culture, the members on the Hill are seeing that their constituents care about this. And if they throw up their hands and say no, they might get voted out of office. And that's a very powerful motivator, of course, as we know in politics. If your currency is votes, you care what your constituents think. And now their constituents are saying, hang on, I like this asset. I might be making money on this asset. I might have a real use for this asset in my day-to-day life. And so they can't just throw their hands up. They have to learn about it more. And when you learn about it more, you become a lot more amenable to it.
Right. Yeah. And I think you're seeing a shift in a lot of politicians in real time where they're realizing just how much their constituents care about this asset. I know we talked about this a little bit in our last episode, but Donald Trump being foremost among those politicians, right? He came out this last week and he said, I like to have a little fun with crypto. And he even said that he accepts Bitcoin as a form of currency. If people want to donate to his campaign or pay him in crypto or in Bitcoin specifically, he's open to that, right? So that's a huge vibe shift in just one single person. On that subject, I'm curious, do you worry about there being some kind of political blowback if Trump himself embraces Bitcoin fully, from the left side of the aisle specifically?
I do, because it shouldn't be a partisan issue. I think it's great that President Trump has evolved on this, and he went from anti-Bitcoin to sort of the Switzerland of, yeah, it's okay, you can play with it. I still love the dollar. I understand that position, and that's perfectly fine. If he says, if you were to like endorse it, then all of a sudden, heading into silly season of electoral politics, you're going to have the people who are on Biden's team and protecting Biden potentially have a knee-jerk reaction. Well, if Trump's for it, I'm against it. That's unhelpful for everybody. I think it's worth pointing out that while he's not a part of the Democratic Party anymore, RFK Jr. has embraced Bitcoin. He bought Bitcoin for all his kids. There's a candidate that I just saw this morning running in Oklahoma for Congress on the Democrat side, who announced that she is accepting digital asset donations for her campaign. I think that's very telling. You've seen a profile of Democrat from New York, Congressman Richie Torres, making the liberal case for crypto. He's been vocally in support of these assets. So the evolution of Trump is really significant because he was so anti just a couple of years ago. The fact that he's evolved this quickly, I think, is very exciting and very promising. But it's important to note that this is a bipartisan, nonpartisan issue, and that comports with the reality of who is involved in this space. It tends to be younger. It tends to be nonpartisan, across partisan lines. Probably more. I think the data we have shows that it's likely more Democrats than Republicans are owners of it, and it's across demographics. It's across ethnic groups. It's across states and localities. It's really sort of it's becoming an issue that isn't tied to any one party, and I think that's a great thing, and it's necessary for success. Really, you don't want one party or another declaring war on your industry. That's not helpful. So we've had great developments over the last months, and I think it's only going to get better from here. We've weathered this bumpy road, this storm, so far, and I think the road is still bumpy, but it's getting smoother.
Right. Yeah. So let's talk about two bumps in the road, right? Let's talk about the first one being President Biden unveiled his budget proposal for the coming year. And part of that proposal includes a 30% excise tax on the electricity that Bitcoin miners use to mine their Bitcoin. So that is a pretty difficult tax for any industry to bear. And it seems like political targeting in a lot of ways. Is it something that you're worried about? Is it something that Bitcoiners generally should be worried about? And maybe even outside of the Bitcoin community, is it something that Americans in general should worry about?
So it's a great question. Let me start with this. So having served in an administration, it's important to note that president's budget documents generally are messaging documents. It is up to Congress to appropriate money. It is up to Congress to create new taxes. This particular proposal, called the DAME tax, digital asset mining excise tax, which has gotten a lot of traction in the industry, people throwing up alarm bells. Rightfully so. It's a bad policy proposal, but the odds of it becoming law are virtually nil because there doesn't seem to be any interest on Capitol Hill. As is tradition, on a bipartisan basis, the president's budget, when it hits the Hill, is usually dead on arrival because it is up to the House of Representatives to initiate appropriations. So very little likelihood of it becoming law, but is significant in this way. It is indicative of a coming policy debate, which is going to be between the parties. So Democrats are more focused on climate change. They are saying that because we need more energy to power data centers for Bitcoin or for any other form of data center, that's going to be an issue because if you generate more fuel, if it's generated by fossil fuels, then you're going to have more climate change, and we can't have that. And so what this proposal signifies is that the administration's preference at this point is to start exploring ways to ration electricity. They want to say, and it says in the proposal, the goal is to effectively eliminate Bitcoin mining in the United States, because they don't want that energy being used for Bitcoin mining. They want to decide what that electricity is used for. That is a terrifying road to go down, for starters. But the other point is, you could eliminate Bitcoin mining and we still don't have enough energy for the future. Bitcoin mining is what, 1% or something of the energy market? It's such a tiny sliver. You could wipe it off the map and it wouldn't make a bit of difference. What you're seeing is a competition between this approach that is signified by this approach, a proposal that you can either ration electricity, or another approach is you generate more of it. And I think most serious minds are recognizing that we have to generate a lot more power. There is just an event in Texas with Larry Fink from BlackRock, the world's foremost climate crusader, alongside the very conservative Lieutenant Governor, Dan Patrick, talking about how, because Texas is growing and thriving financially, they need more power. And whether it's natural gas or wind or solar or hydro or nuclear or whatever it is, we need more power. That's just, Texas is a microcosm of the rest of the country. So instead of rationing power, we really need to build up more power generation. That's the reality of the world we're living in. And so I would say that this tax is not going to become law, but other industries, not Bitcoin miners, not only Bitcoin miners, I should say, but AI data centers, manufacturing plants, steel mills, chemical mills, paper plants, any operation that is of large scale that requires a lot of electricity, a lot of power. You don't want to go down this road of an administration telling you what is a good use of electricity and what isn't. Because when the government starts rationing electricity, it's picking winners and losers. It's choosing which businesses are going to survive. It's going to stifle innovation. It's going to stifle progress in our way of life. It's going to be really, really dangerous and unhelpful, and give the government an amount of control that I think should be really scary for a lot of people. So that's why I say you don't have to be worried about this tax becoming law, but you have to worry about this frame of mind that the government should ration electricity instead of generating more electricity, when that's truly the solution for the economy of the future.
Right. It seems like there's two different mindsets. There's the scarcity mindset and the abundance mindset. And the scarcity mindset says we need to ration your electricity. We need to pick winners and losers, depending on what industry they're involved with. Whereas the abundance mindset says, no, all of us, regardless of industry, need more energy. And I think that abundance mindset is what drives true innovation, right? Because not only do Bitcoin miners require large amounts of electricity, AI data centers will as well. And whichever country is leading on AI will likely lead in the 21st century economy. And so two very different visions presented there. And I think it's fascinating because it's a decelerationist mindset to say, oh no, we need to ration, we need to cut down, we need to cut back in any way we possibly can. But then there's more of a accelerationist mindset where it says, no, more power is good for everybody. It's good for human thriving and flourishing. That's the option I think we should be going towards. So, yeah.
Just one more thought on that is that consuming energy should not be viewed as a bad thing. Consuming energy, as you rightly stated, is a signal of human thriving. We should want more power. We do want more power. We need more power. We need abundance, energy abundance. An energy scarcity mindset where the government gets to ration who gets electricity and who doesn't is not a recipe for success for any country. And so energy abundance is the only way we can continue our upward trajectory to the future.
100%. So we talked, Brian, about potential bumps in the road in terms of Bitcoin adoption. And I think there's two different vectors of attack, right? There's this energy vector, which we've discussed at length, but then there's another vector of trying to smear Bitcoin and cryptocurrency more broadly as an industry for illicit financing, specifically terrorist financing. Back in October of last year, a national news story was released that claimed that Hamas had raised $135 million in cryptocurrency to finance its terrorist attack against Israel, right? However, as an industry, we thoroughly debunked that claim, showing with on-chain analysis that the actual numbers that Hamas had raised in cryptocurrency were far smaller than what was reported by national media. In addition to that, there's ample evidence that presents the fact that terrorists actually use crypto in much smaller numbers than traditional means of financing, whether it be bank cards or cold hard cash or even banking itself. Even so, it seems like we can't put this to rest because another national news story was released this last week that claims that $165 million was quote unquote linked to cryptocurrency financing related to Hamas, right? So why is it that this story is so hard to put to bed? And what's your take on this new national news story? Do you see it as damage control for the fact that we have thoroughly debunked this claim? I'm curious your thoughts on that.
I do, unfortunately, think it's damage control. They used the news hook of the Treasury Department writing a letter in response to some members of Congress, members of the Senate, who had expressed concern over the first article. It's sort of rehashing the old story with indignance, with a refusal to acknowledge that they were off base. The new one at least admits in the article that this huge number that they've attached to it, $165 million, actually probably relates to a combined traditional finance and digital asset total, and that they actually are not really sure how much of that is digital assets, the likelihood being infinitesimally small. And yet they blame the entire number, 165 million, on digital assets. It's just incredibly frustrating because it's so salacious. And the headline that they put there is so detached from the facts of the article. And there's some language in there. We're talking about a Wall Street Journal article from this morning. It's very frustrating because it's creating hysteria and a panic with like salacious clickbait that is just so detached from the facts of the story that they're effectively maligning an entire industry, claiming that they're funding terrorism when it's not really true. They also admit in the article, I think this is a critical point, that the vast majority, the key sources of funding for Hamas have been Iran, have been taxes that they levy in Gaza. It's been effectively a $500 million investment fund that they have. I mean, it's all traditional financial avenues that they're using. It's not digital assets. They almost, they doth protest too much because they even said, well, the evidence shows that this is not merely a small, crowdsourcing issue where certain members of terror groups are sending each other, money back and forth in digital assets. Well, when you admit that pretty much all the group level, the institution level, Hamas level funding is coming from Iran and taxes and their investment fund, then you effectively admit that to the extent there's, Bitcoin or other assets involved, it's pretty much small potatoes. They use suitcases full of cash. They use traditional finance transfer methods. That's the vast majority of it. I think this was a bit of face saving because the Treasury Department honestly testified in the Senate that Hamas's, finance mechanisms of choice are actually more traditional methods like the ones I've outlined, and that it's not really cryptocurrency or Bitcoin. And that probably angered certain members of the Senate. It may have angered certain people in the administration. I think there's sort of a policy battle going on between pro-digital asset and anti-digital asset folks in different levels of the government. It probably made some people angry, so they felt the need to say something else. Unfortunately, what ended up being reported was more of the same salacious clickbait, where the headline is detached from the facts, which remain that the blockchain is transparent and immutable. The government's gotten pretty good at tracking it. It's really not the currency of choice. They didn't even mention that last year Hamas put out a press release saying, please don't send us Bitcoin because the government is able to track down the addresses due to the transparent nature of the blockchain. They didn't even mention that, right? It was just kind of a rehash of the same that creates a bit of hysteria and clickbait, but doesn't actually focus the reader's attention on the facts of the case. So it's very frustrating to see this reporting just kind of redone again in an irresponsible way. But I don't know what else to say. I feel like I've beaten this dead horse.
I feel like I've been the same dead horse. And the good news is that I don't think it's resonating in the way that it was last fall. I mean, this story dropped this morning, and there's been some commentary on it within the crypto and Bitcoin community itself. But outside of that, it doesn't seem to be really latching on, because I think people know after Undersecretary Nelson testified before Congress a few weeks ago that, in fact, the numbers initially reported by the Wall Street Journal are wildly inflated. People just really aren't paying attention to that anymore. And so I think it's progress in a lot of ways. Before we close out, Brian, is there anything else you think we should discuss related to Bitcoin, price action, or the policy outlook looking forward?
It is always a wild ride in this space. It's been a particularly optimistic one. In the aftermath of the ETFs, the price, didn't do much. It took a little bit of time for people to get educated and to start learning and to start wanting to be involved. It took a lot of time for institutions to realize the value and to start adopting it, opening their mind to it, not standing in the way of it. Now that the politics are starting to be downhill of culture or downstream of culture, I think that's a cause for tremendous optimism. And I think we probably have a new floor. And I think the sky's the limit, because as more people understand the value of this asset, I think it's going to be a force for good in terms of people's investments, people's savings. It's going to be a force for good in terms of motivating, hopefully, motivating governments to keep their spending in check and produce better monetary policy. I think we're just in a very optimistic time, and it's exciting. And the more people coming in, the better. We don't care if you're Republican, Democrat, Independent, or otherwise. We're talking about the money and financial system of the future. There's gonna be a lot of changes really fast. Come on in, the water's warm.
The water is very warm, especially at this point with the start of a new bull market. And like you said, Bitcoin is freedom money. It's money that discriminates against no one. It's money for every color, class, and creed. And I think we have a long way to go in just educating the masses on the use cases of Bitcoin mining and the many things you can do with Bitcoin in terms of saving. There's just so much more to go. And it's a great and exciting time to be part of this industry. So with that, we'll close out, and we'll see you all next time on our next episode of the Peer-to-Peer Policy Podcast.
Thanks for watching, everybody. Have a good day.